Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into the absolute biggest geopolitical mystery of the year. We're looking at an apocalyptic global oil shock that simply vanished into thin air. For weeks, every mathematical model said the world economy was about to completely implode, and then, well, it just didn't. The world actually got a savior, but it was the absolute last country you'd ever guess, operating in total, complete secrecy.
So remember at the start of the conflict involving Iran, when the media predicted absolute catastrophe? Analysts were looking at the data and screaming that 13,000 flights were going to be canceled. Major cities were literally hours away from going entirely dark, and gas prices were going to triple. And the terrifying part? Their math wasn't wrong. The world really was supposed to end, economically speaking. Yet somehow, an eerie normalcy prevailed.
Part 1. The crisis that didn't happen. To figure out exactly how we dodged this doomsday scenario, we first have to look at the hard, terrifying math of the global oil market.
Look, the global oil market is this incredibly tightly balanced system. Exactly 100 million barrels are produced every single day, and exactly 100 million barrels are consumed. There is zero slack. So, what happened when the Strait of Hormuz was shut down? An unprecedented 20 million barrels of oil per day were instantly wiped from the map. That is a sudden 20% deficit. Imagine 1 in every 5 flights, or 1 in every 5 factories, just completely powering down.
Now, the world fought back with absolutely everything it had. Alternate pipelines bypassed the strait to add 7 million barrels a day. Then, 32 countries teamed up for the largest emergency reserve release in history, which added another 2.5 million barrels daily. But you know what? It just wasn't enough. We were still staring down a catastrophic deficit of 10 to 12 million barrels. The mighty US and Japanese strategic reserves were plunging towards zero, and the global power grid was basically on the brink of total collapse.
Part 2. China's secret oil plunge. Right when the math dictated that global infrastructure should be crumbling, market analysts noticed an impossible anomaly from a completely unlikely savior.
Here's the crazy twist. China, the world's biggest oil importer, whose entire economy fundamentally relies on massive, uninterrupted energy consumption, suddenly and inexplicably cut its imports by 5.5 million barrels a day, literally overnight. They were going cold turkey on the exact substance that powers their rise as an industrial superpower, right when the global market was on the absolute brink. Let's put that 5.5 million barrel drop into perspective, because it is massive. China basically erased a volume of daily demand equal to all of India's imports, plus the top 5 economies in Europe, combined. Poof, gone. By magically erasing this massive chunk of demand from the global system, China shrank that devastating 20% global deficit down to a super manageable 5%. Against all odds, they saved the system.
Part 3. How China pulled it off. We know what happened, but the big question is, how? How on earth does an industrial behemoth like China just quit oil cold turkey while keeping daily life for its citizens completely normal?
Well, they started with some smaller, quiet interventions. First, a secret ban preventing their massive refineries from exporting fuel to the rest of Asia. Second, they fired up over 50 large-scale coal plants, finding alternative ways to use coal instead of oil to make things like plastics and fertilizer. And third, they leveraged their massive, heavily subsidized fleet of electric vehicles and high-speed rail, absorbing the shock by simply nudging citizens away from gas-powered cars and domestic flights.
But honestly, all those clever moves combined still only account for a fraction of that 5.5 million barrel drop. The true secret weapon was revealed by satellite imagery showing the roofs of massive silo domes physically rising and falling. Analysts realized China had built a covert, totally unverified network of above-ground silos and underground caverns, hoarding an estimated 1.4 billion barrels of oil. To visualize that, imagine a tank of oil the size of Manhattan.
To really get how wild this is, you have to look at this staggering comparison. If totally cut off from the outside world, India's reserves would last just 4 days. Europe's might last 10 to 20 days. Even the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve, long considered the absolute envy of the world, would tap out around 60 days. But China? China had secretly stored enough oil to comfortably pull 4 million barrels a day from their reserves and survive completely cut off for over a year.
Part 4. The Dark Fleet Conspiracy. Which begs the obvious question. How exactly do you hide a billion-plus barrel shopping spree right under the nose of the global community?
Basically, they built a masterclass in dodging sanctions. Since Iran and Russia were heavily sanctioned and effectively cut off from the global market, China swooped in as the only willing buyer, getting a massive discount in the process. They loaded this oil onto unregulated dark fleet tankers, slapped a Malaysian oil label on the cargo paperwork, and then quietly processed it through this network of small, independent Chinese refineries that are affectionately known as teapots.
But the financial trick that made this totally invisible is just fascinating. See, the entire global oil market is traditionally traded in US dollars, which gives the US government the power to track and sanction anyone through the American banking system. But China used a magic hack. They paid for all this illicit oil in their own currency, the Chinese yuan. By entirely bypassing the dollar, these massive transactions became completely invisible to US banks and international sanctions.
Part 5, 4 theories for the rescue. Okay, so we know exactly how they stockpiled it and how they used it. But we need to ask the most important question: why? Why orchestrate this massive, secret maneuver that inadvertently bailed out their biggest rival, the US economy?
Analysts have basically narrowed it down to 4 pretty chilling theories. First, the Malacca dilemma, testing if they could survive a U.S. naval blockade and a potential conflict over Taiwan. Second, leverage, knowing they could crash the U.S. economy at any second just by resuming their normal oil imports. Third, pure self-interest, keeping Western economies alive simply so we can continue buying Chinese exports. And finally, the oil price weapon, proving to the world that China now possesses Saudi-level power to manipulate the global market.
Part 6. The new global oil order. The truth is probably a combination of all 4 of those theories. But no matter what the exact motive might be, this silent intervention has permanently rewritten the global geopolitical map.
We are looking at a total paradigm shift here. The old guard, the US, Saudi Arabia, and Russia, the ones who dictated oil security for a century, have been exposed. The US couldn't guarantee the free flow of oil, and Russia is severely hampered by sanctions. Enter the new powers. Iran proved it can unilaterally shut down 20% of the world's supply, and China proved it is the only nation on Earth capable of absorbing that massive shock entirely on its own.
So by secretly saving the global economy this time around, China basically revealed an unprecedented, almost terrifying superpower. They hold the kill switch for the entire global oil market. The question isn't if they have the power anymore. The real question we all have to ask ourselves now is, when and how are they going to deploy this weapon next?